All right. Hello, everybody. So, Coach Reese or Sabin and Wilkie here from Haddonfield Academy in Haddonfield. And we're just hopping on for another seminar. Last time we had Chrissy Bittner-Duffield talking about pre- and post-workout nutrition. Today we have Matt Hinsey from the training room. We have a partnership with them. Fantastic people. My first relationship with Matt was he helped me out get past an injury in my AC joint in my shoulder. So he helped me out with PT. Absolutely fantastic. Wonderful people down there. Really great approach to physical therapy. It's, I would say, non-threatening. Like you really feel comfortable asking questions and welcomed when you're there. It's just a fantastic atmosphere. That's why we wanted to be connected with them. Anytime you're doing any kind of physical activity other than sleeping in bed, you know you're at risk of some sort of injury. Maybe even sleeping in bed too. So here, doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Korean Tung Soo, it's fantastic to have a physical therapist swing by every month and say, hey, you know, your elbow's bothering you, do this, or hey, stop doing that, or adjust this, and that's what Matt's here for. Plus, we just like having him around. We're trying to get him to roll on the mats, but hasn't happened yet. We're working on it. But this is Matt Hinsey, so everybody, give a warm welcome to Matt Hinsey, and feel free to hit us with questions. He's going to talk a little bit today about hip mobility, which is a huge thing in the martial arts world, whether you're on the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu side, opening your legs up for guard, or going for guard passes, or you're on the Tung Soo side, throwing side kicks, inside-outside kicks, wheel kicks. Hip mobility is huge, not to mention every day in the real world outside of martial arts.
Absolutely.
But Matt, tell us a little bit about hip mobility.
Sure.
And just like, where do we even start? So for me, not as a physical therapist, where do I need to start with the thought process?
Absolutely. No, that's a great question. Thanks for having me too, by the way. So as far as hip mobility is concerned, from our end, what we're looking at is there's a couple different things that can limit your hip range of motion, hip mobility. Is it the muscles that are surrounding the hip joint, which there's so many different tests and things that we can look at that can kind of assess, is it more muscular based? But then there's also the joint itself can get stiff sometimes too. So kind of deciphering between, is it something related to the actual hip joint that we can kind of address through manual therapy and kind of eventually showing patients, clients, what they can kind of do on their own.
Yeah.
Or if it's something more muscular based, we can take a soft tissue approach, go through what can be done in the clinic plus on your own pre-post workout from a soft tissue standpoint, and following that up with kind of different stretches. So, but to your point, the importance of hip mobility, especially in martial arts, is just incredible.
Yeah.
Where if you don't have that hip mobility and you're trying to go to these different end range positions, when you're going from one end range and then going to the other, being able to have that mobility is huge from an injury prevention standpoint. Huge.
So you're saying from injury prevention, what type of injuries are we preventing? Can you give me a couple of those common ones that you see come in a lot?
Yeah, so we'll see usually with some of the not older, but not necessarily kids, you'll see more like their labrums. You'll see kind of a labral tear in the hip, which is essentially the suction cup that kind of keeps the hip in the socket pretty much. So that's a fairly common one to kind of see. IT band type issues, kind of outer hip type pain is something that we'll commonly see as well. You can even make the argument that anything limited hip mobility can result in a little bit extra lower back pain as well too.
Interesting. What types of motions maybe do we need to avoid when worrying about hip mobility, so we can start working on stretching and all the things you might give us tools-wise? But are there any particular motions where it's like, hey, your hip was not designed to do that? Kind of avoid that type of motion. Anything like that?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I think from our standpoint, we always have to look at what are the demands of the activity. So knowing what is necessary and what's required beyond daily life, but also within what's going on there on the mats too, is huge. So we'll take a look at that, where if it's something that we would say, okay, from that standpoint, maybe hold off on this particular motion. So it's very individualized. So it's not saying one particular hip motion is a bad hip motion. I would say of the hip motions that would put the most amount of stress to the hip joint would be anything where the foot is outside of the hip joint and you're kind of that hips and the thighs kind of rotating inwardly.
Okay. Yeah.
That would be the one that I would say is where most people are limited, and where there's more of the likelihood of kind of injuring the actual hip joint itself,
Gotcha.
specifically the labrum.
Makes sense. All right, so now, like, you mentioned a couple of, like, the pains that people might have that come in with a labral tear and that type of stuff. Is there any kind of sensations or things that we should feel we're like, whoa, okay, I need to back off this, and it's, you know, it's not pain yet, but maybe it is pain, or things that we should be aware of that is like, okay, that's a warning sign that my hips are not doing what they should be doing.
Absolutely.
I need to back off.
Yeah, I would say anything clicking, catching that's painful is definitely some of those early warning signs related to something within the hip joint itself. Related to anything more soft tissue based, you may not necessarily have pain while doing whatever activity out on the mat or just any general workouts or daily life type stuff. From a soft tissue standpoint, you may not have pain while you're doing that, but if you're getting more of that pain that creeps up later in the day, later that night, it starts to impact sleep, those are things that we're kind of looking out for as far as warning signs too.
Gotcha. So what things can we do to strengthen the hip mobility, increase the hip mobility as far as injury prevention? Can you give us a couple things like, hey, do this and do that?
Yeah, sure. I would say before any sort of workout, a dynamic warm-up is huge as far as any sort of lunge, any sort of hip type of rotational type movement is important, because you're prepping the hip, you're prepping those muscles and the joint for the activity that they're about to do.
Gotcha.
Afterwards, finishing out any sort of activity, finishing any sort of workout with a static stretch helps as far as muscle tightness. That's a result of muscle fatigue afterwards. So kind of doing more of the dynamic hip openers or lunges, squats, bridges, even lying on your back, raising the hips up, are great kind of dynamic warm-ups.
Gotcha.
Or after the fact, any sort of kind of crossing the leg, that's like one of the static stretches you could do post-workout. Anything for the hip flexors, glutes, hamstrings, quads, all of those muscle groups that cross the hip joint. Static stretches after a workout can help with that overall mobility too.
Fantastic. So that's from like a warm-up before the workout, stretching after. Are there any types of workouts that we should do where it's like, hey, do this particular lunge or do this particular squat, it'll help increase the muscles around the hip? Is there anything like that?
Again, I think a lot of it boils back down to what's individual for the individual themselves. But I think any sort of squat variation, just a regular squat working within the allowable hip range of motion, where there's different foot positions, because not everybody's squat is going to look the exact same, but being able to squat with the feet a little bit wider, maybe toes pointed out, a lot of times can take a lot of the stress off the front of the hip joint that way too. And then any sort of different variety of a squat, kind of squatting out towards the side for more of a side squat type motion. A lunge is fine, where if a lunge is too uncomfortable at the hips or the knees, elevating the back leg on a bench or a chair is always an option as well. Beyond that, I would say any sort of deadlift type motion where you're focusing more on the muscles of the glutes and the hamstrings kind of gets the other side of the hip there as well.
Gotcha.
So a combination of the two is always best.
That's fantastic. So we talked about warming up before, stretching after, what type of exercises would be good. We talked about warning signs. How about like is there any, and this might even be more for Chrissy Duffield, like nutritional stuff where it's like, hey, this is good to help with recovery for things that you would like to see as a physical therapist? Yeah,
I mean, we don't really dive into that too much, but I would say just from any sort of injury recovery standpoint, or just from a performance standpoint too, making sure that you're fueling your bodies appropriately with the right amount of carbs, plus also from a muscle recovery standpoint, the right amount of proteins too. So we don't really touch on that too much, but I mean that's an instance where we would refer and kind of talk to the nutritionist, and if that is a concern of any of our patients, we'll absolutely have them reach out to her for sure.
What are other like common questions or things people might have when they come on with a hip mobility issue? Like what other things where, like, I haven't dealt with hip mobility issues, right? I haven't had any injury there. are there other questions that maybe if I was on the other side, I would be asking, like, hey, Matt, what do I do with this? Or
Yeah, sure.
What are those common
Sure.
questions you might hear?
I think the biggest question is once we get people set up with their home program and once they complete their course of care, they're pain-free, they're able to do their activities that they want to do. The question at the end that we more than most likely always get is, do I have to do these for the rest of my life? So the answer to that is, what I always say is, when you're coming in to see us, it's more than just fix it. There's a lifestyle change that ends up occurring where implementing it, maybe not necessarily have to do all of the exercises that we've done throughout that course of care, but the ones that have been the most beneficial at the end in the course of care from an injury prevention standpoint, that's where the lifestyle change occurs, where implementing some of the dynamic warm-up stuff, implementing some of the post-activity stretching, mobility work. Those are the things that I would say people always ask, like, do I do this forever? Yeah, but it's part of the change that's kind of occurring to make sure that you're still pain-free to be able to do what you want to do.
Gotcha. What other things? Anything else about hip mobility we should know?
I think we covered it all. I would say you can't necessarily stress it's important enough because, we're focusing on the hip itself, but the hip is the link between the back and the knee and the ankle too. So that there may not necessarily be pain as a result of limited hip mobility, but it can cause issues into the lower back, down into the knee. You can even make the argument sometimes down into the ankle too, depending on what positions are uncomfortable for somebody. So we always look at it. I think it's such an important component of the chain of the human body that when we're assessing somebody, whether they're coming in for their ankles, their knee, their hip, we're always looking at hip mobility. Its importance can't be stressed enough, just from what we have to do on a daily basis, a daily life type base too.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, that was great. Yeah, hip mobility is huge here for us doing martial arts. As you say, every time you come in and watch class, you're like, oh yeah, so you guys need this, you need that, you're doing your bridges over here, which is great. If you guys have any questions, we didn't have any come in during this talk, which is okay, that's all right. This is our first talk online with Matt. He'll be doing probably about once a month. We'll try to get these and do different topics. So if you have different topics you want us to talk about or any questions, drop them in the comments below. We'll either talk about it next time or I'll reach out to you or I'll connect you with Matt to get those answers before having to wait a month to get them, And if you're looking at all for a physical therapist at all, my suggestion is go down to the training room. It's right here in town. It might even be walking distance from your house. And if it's that close and it's fantastic people, it's a win-win. So I'd go check them out if you have anything. Anything else, Matt?
That's everything. That was great.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Have a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you in class soon.
Cool. That was fun, man.
Yeah.
I love that stuff.